Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. We've been on a bit of a hiatus. It's been about 2.5 weeks and a lot's happened. We're recording this on Monday, the 30th of September. How have you been, Richard?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Busy as always, seeing you at certain bits and pieces events and seeing you've been jetting around, doing lots of travel as always and seeing people in the region.
I haven't been writing a lot. In fact, I've committed myself that I want to get a couple of pieces out talking about the lessons learned for Australia from the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. It was a topic of a speech I gave at the Williams Foundation last week. But I've been in Taiwan in the last week. Just before we saw the fairly historic Taiwan Strait transit, not historic from Australia, that's pretty common these days, but historic from a New Zealand and a Japan standpoint, which we will get into. Speaking of things we will get into, what's been happening in the region? We won't cover the last 2.5 weeks because lots has happened. What's happened recently?
So, I guess starting off talking about the Taiwan Straits. Let's go straight for it. The Japanese destroyer, and I'm now going to mangle the name, the Sazanmi, I'm going to go with, and we'll see whether that's right or wrong. So anyway, a Japanese destroyer, I'm still on safe ground there, transited the Taiwan Straits alongside HMS Sydney, coming south from Korea, or near Korea, as we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, and the New Zealand HMNZS Aotearoa. So they transited the Straits, and they have now actually come south and have been doing what I refer to as a joint patrol, and have already been told off by Jen for calling it a joint patrol when it is actually a multilateral maritime cooperative activity with ships from the Philippines and the US in the West Philippine Sea. As you say, this is relatively routine business nowadays from an Australian ship, but this is, I think, I'm right in saying the first time certainly in a very long time, that a Japanese warship has transited the Straits, and it's pretty unusual for the Kiwis as well. So I think this is clearly part of a gradual hardening and sort of statement making from both governments, and the cooperative activity, again, connecting up. We're seeing this quite a lot now in terms of making statements and sort of signalling in the South China Sea sort of engagement with the US and the Philippines. So I think it's interesting, and certainly from a Japanese standpoint, pretty notable.
It is notable. I was just reading some reporting. I thought there might have been 2 New Zealand ships, and I was going to get very excited, but it was one. It looks like, but it is significant, right? Because we've certainly seen Japan, in the way they employ their ships, trying to avoid provocative actions towards China, and we saw a recent event a couple of months ago now. I can't remember exactly when a Japanese destroyer entered Chinese territorial waters for 20 minutes, which you can do under international law. But Japan seemed quite upset about it. There was going to be an investigation. So they do avoid things that might be viewed by China as provocative in the maritime domain. So it's interesting to see that starting to change with the supporting of these multilateral maritime cooperative activities, which doesn't make any sense. And the transit of the Taiwan Strait. And it was interesting with the MMCA, some of the reporting talked about it actually having, effectively it was an exercise. It looked like it had a shore phase, a series of briefings. I'm not sure how detailed that could have been given the timing, some Officer Watch moves, etc. So I think it is significant that Japan is doing this, but also that New Zealand is doing this. And we were talking just before we started the show, and I think you disagree with me. This is not a full thought out recommendation, but I do wonder whether the more forward-leaning naval activities from New Zealand that we're seeing, so the Taiwan Strait Transit, the MMCA, and some of the different posturing from the 2023 elected New Zealand government might mean that they are thinking about aligning with Australia on Australia's general purpose frigate. Now, that might be a stretch too far, but I think it might make sense. What's your take on that?
I certainly think it makes a lot of sense if they're willing to stump up the cash. And I'm not an expert on New Zealand defence matters, but my sense has been that there's been a fair bit of talking a good game recently, but not a lot of action in terms of money. So we'll see. It's certainly been something that ever since the new GP frigate was announced, the idea of a kind of a Anzac Mark II has been floating around, and it does make a lot of sense in many ways. So I think, it would be good to see. I think it makes a lot of sense both from an Australian perspective and from a New Zealand perspective, but it relies on more than words. And as we all know, it's quite easy for governments to talk about things. It's a lot harder for them to open the checkbook and actually sign on the dotted line. So we'll see about that one. And this is not the only thing that's been happening in the South China Sea over the past week or so.
No, it's not. Certainly, there's been some reporting in the last week that through September, the Philippines have seen a surge of Chinese vessels in their exclusive economic zone. So they reported about 251 during a period of the 17th to the 23rd of September, which is a significant number, and that does look to be a significant increase. Majority of that were maritime militia vessels, about 204 during that week. And noticeably, a lot of those surged into areas around Sabina Shoal when we saw the Philippines Coast Guard vessel having to depart Sabina Shoal. 16 PLA Navy warships also makes up that number, and about 28 Coast Guard ships. So even though we haven't seen an incident of late, so certainly since the reporting of the agreement, I think now in July, between the Philippines and China around Second Thomas Shoal resupply missions, things have certainly died down around there. We did see tensions heat up around Sabina Shoal, certainly with the deployment of China's Monster Coast Guard vessel and the Philippines stationing of one of their largest Coast Guard vessels there as well. We saw ramming, lots of reporting. That reporting has died down in terms of those incidents, but we've certainly seen a surge, it looks like, of Chinese maritime militia vessels into the West Philippine Sea and into the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And if we get this podcast out quickly, which is my job to edit it, so we will, I'd say that it is timely because this week, actually, the Australian Naval Institute has Commodore J. Terriella visiting Australia. He'll be speaking at the Goldrick Seminar this week and at the Press Club on Tuesday of this week. He is the comms or the spokesperson for the Philippines Coast Guard, who puts out a lot of the reporting about Chinese activities. So if you can catch him at the Goldrick Seminar, at the Press Club, or one of the other events this week, it would be very worthwhile. What else has been happening in the region, Richard?
So sticking with the kind of, cooperative activity, so exercise Kakadu has come to a close. We've not had a huge amount of reporting about it. Again, we were just talking about that earlier, but participants have included obviously Australia, but the US, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, France, Vietnam, Canada, and we mentioned before that there was a sort of reasonably significant RAM presence, including HMAS Warramunga and one of the Collins class submarines. So that's come to a close, and then building off that, and I think sort of off the back of that, there's been something which I think is quite interesting, which is the that Warramunga, the USS Dewey, reloaded ESSMs at Darwin, and the Canadian ship HMCS Vancouver reloaded at Broome. And this is the first time that we've seen reloading of this type of ordnance in northern ports, so sort of either Darwin or Broome. Normally this takes place either at Eden on the east coast or HMS Stirling on the west. So sounds like a really obvious kind of thing. In terms of geography, you want to be able to reload ordnance up north. Makes a lot more sense. So it's good to see. And I think this is part of comes off the back of the wider developments of the sort of wharfing facilities up at Darwin. But you'll probably know more about that than I do.
Well, interestingly, I'm pretty sure that this rearming actually happened at East Arm, not at the Darwin Naval Base, which is an interesting development. In fact, I'm going to pull it up now just to check that. But it is so. One of the restrictions on the Royal Australian Navy for a long time has been where it can load its missiles, which has traditionally only been Eden on the New South Wales coast. And HMAS Stirling, which are pretty well out of the way for ships deploying. There have been on occasion other places, but one of the key restrictions is actually the authorities for the wharf to actually carry that much EO. It's not actually the cranes and things like that. And some people say, oh, God, why do we bother with those restrictions? You wouldn't do it in wartime. Well, there are plenty enough examples of issues with explosive ordnance in peacetime and wartime to show that either way, you still need to worry about these things. So,
yes.
Clearly that's been worked through. Yes, the replenishment actually occurred at East Arm Wharf, not at the naval base, which I think is interesting. But clearly that's worked through. Clearly there are now approvals in place to transfer that degree of explosive ordnance across those two wharfs, which I think is really, really positive. Certainly we need to have more flexibility in terms of where we can reload our ships. And also support other ships. And I think I want to say I've used the word historic a couple of times. Everyone uses the word historic, but it's not actually historic. But I think that's probably the first time that we have replenished a missile on a Canadian warship. Certainly in a very, very long time. We did see a US warship last year after Talisman Sabre go down to Eden, which was the first time we'd done it on a US warship for a very, very long time. So good to see those developments. I think a really positive direction. Of course, the next thing I'd be keen to see would be US reporting in Australia working with them of the ability to replenish missiles at sea, of which we have spoken about, which is still a really key constraint on operations, and you only need to look to the Red Sea to see how much ships use missiles when they are trying to defend themselves. Anyway, that was a little bit tangential, but some good news about being able to reload missiles at East Arm and in Broome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, you say the inability to reload VLS at sea is one of the kind of the very significant constraints on any kind of high-intensity naval activity at the moment. So short of being able to do so, having bases where you can reload as close to potential theatres of operation as possible makes absolute sense. So this is clearly a kind of a no-brainer in many respects. Carry on.
Oh, no, it is. I was actually going to segue. We're not so skilled at this segue. But I was about to segue onto the reporting of a Chinese submarine sinking alongside the wharf in China. And details about this seem to be a little bit sketchy. They don't all necessarily match up with each other. I'm going to do some cross promotion here and say, but the person who discovered this, which is Tom Shugart from CNAS, will be joining me for the Saltwater Strategist this week to break this down. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, how he worked that out, and all the other work he's been doing on the PLA-N, you'll be able to grab that over the weekend on the Saltwater Strategist. But back to this episode of Maritime Matters. So what's happened with this submarine and the reporting?
Yeah, so there was some reporting, as you say, that was sort of going around on social media a little while back, suggesting that from commercial satellite imagery, there was an indications that a Chinese submarine had sunk alongside a pier, particularly sort of deployment of large cranes and things like that to try and presumably sort of lift it. Now, that was the initial reporting was around this being an SSK, a conventional submarine. Over the weekend, no, it must have been late last week. It was there was some reporting in the Washington Post, picked up elsewhere, of sort of comments by US government officials suggesting that, as they saw it, that this was true, it had happened, and that they believe it to be the next generation of Chinese SSN, so nuclear-powered submarine, which had sunk alongside the pier in Wuhan, either in late May or early June. So, as you say, lots of sort of uncertainty about this, and then there were then questions around the precise nature of the American government comments and all of that back and forth. And of course, this fits into wider stories. There were stories floating around last year about the Chinese losing a submarine in the Taiwan Straits or relatively near Taiwan, again, which were largely unconfirmed. So I'm always a little bit of a skeptic on some of these sorts of things, but it appears that this actually does have some grounding, and I guess comes back to the point that doing this is hard. As I understand it, this is the new submarine facility that they're standing up. So this is the second of their sort of significant SSN building facilities, and so yeah, doing this kind of thing is hard, and issues happen. Preferably, they don't happen with nuclear-propelled submarines. But it appears that in this case, maybe they have. So, without more detail, it's difficult to know. But it does kind of highlight both the challenges that the PLA face in trying to kind of catch up to a degree with the West, but also just how difficult this type of endeavour is, and something that is worth keeping in mind as Australia is about to embark on that kind of endeavour. So
it is, and I also think too that often, and this will be a point that I more cross promotion. You'll get sick of me, but this will be a point that I'll talk to Tom Shugart about on the Saltwater Strategist out this weekend, talking about the PLA Navy. Often when we talk about the what is, I mean, incredibly impressive ability of the PLA and of China more broadly to produce a rapid amount of ships, submarines, missiles, aircraft, etc. I think we often look at the quantity and assume its quality and assume that they don't suffer the same problems that we suffer, with tankers with shaft issues and all that sort of stuff. Just because they don't have the same transparent reporting doesn't mean they don't suffer the same issues. So it just probably, if proven to be true, is just a reminder of that fact, that we often assume that they're 10 feet tall, but they have the same challenges. On China, while we're talking about China, not quite in the maritime matters space, except for the fact that it landed in the Pacific Ocean, I think it's worth highlighting the significance of the PLA's rocket force ballistic missile test last week. So landed in French Polynesia, about 12,000 kilometers from China. Reportedly the first international rocket launch of this range that has happened since the 1980s, or ICBM launched by China since the 1980s. Normally they try and test them internally to China. It looks like a lot of regional countries did not know about it. Certainly there's some reporting that China informed the US prior to the launch, which is positive. For a long time, the US and Russia have had agreements that when they launch ballistic missiles, they let each other know, so they're not assuming that it's the start of a nuclear attack. So that's positive, because that agreement is not in place with China, but they've obviously followed this as an international norm, letting the US know. But there is some reporting that New Zealand, Australia, Fiji, and some other countries in the region were very surprised when they either heard the reporting of or tracked, I'm assuming, this ballistic missile entering the Pacific. So a bit of activity did hit the maritime domain. Any kind of thoughts or comments on that?
No, I'm not. To be honest with you, I don't know enough about the Chinese rocket force forces and things to know whether this is something that they're developing as an obvious kind of test, or whether there's a statement element to this. But It does. It sort of fits into obviously the wider pattern. Good news, as you say, that there's reporting in sort of them pre-warning the Americans. As you say, we don't ideally want a third world war to start by accident, but questions about who else is informed and what else is going on. But testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles is not something that's that unusual. The French do it reasonably regularly. The Brits and the Americans do it in the Atlantic, again, relatively regularly, or not that regularly for the British. But so it does. I don't think it's necessary always to read huge amounts into this, although, as you say, the fact that it's the first Chinese one internationally for a very long time is obviously noteworthy.
Yeah, look, and I think it is just a reminder that China has a very capable ICBM force. There was some reporting last year after some sackings of a number of the rocket force leadership that reporting that was definitely not verified, that they had been filling their rockets with water as opposed to rocket fuel, etc., etc. I think this is just a demonstration of clearly how capable they are. Before we move on to capability, and I'm going to spring this on you a little bit, Richard, because I forgot to put this in the notes, but I think it's worthwhile mentioning. It makes everything more exciting. The US CNO actually released her most recent navigation plan, which I have had on my reading list to get into and try and break down and break down what this means for Australia or how we should be thinking about things. And I thought there was some interesting quotes from it that I just want to kind of highlight. We'll put a link to the September 24 navigation plan from the US CNO in their notes, in the show notes. I guess it's kind of, when you think about it from an Australian perspective, if you're an Australian viewer, it's kind of the equivalent of a plan Polaris or a plan Mercator with just a bunch more detail in it. In fact, a lot more detail in it. That's probably a terrible comparison, but I guess in terms of strategic documentation, that's where it kind of sits. We don't really have an equivalent then in Australia. I think there was an interesting quote where it talks about the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China to our Navy now goes well beyond just the size of the PLA Navy fleet. Ships matter greatly, but gone are the days when we assessed threats based purely on the number of battle force ships or tonnage, which I thought was an interesting one. Also, a quote there: through operational concepts like multi-domain precision warfare, grey zone in economic campaigns, the expansion of dual-use infrastructure, which is a key trend we're seeing in the Indian Ocean, and dual-use forces like the Maritime Militia, and a growing nuclear arsenal, the PRC presents a complex multi-domain and multi-axis threat, which is something we all knew, but it's interesting to see it there in black and white in the navigation plan. So basically kind of the strategic document, public-facing document for the US Navy. And there does seem to be a bit of a trend throughout it as well, focusing on that 2027 timeframe or the Davidson window, which I think a lot of people kind of don't necessarily believe in that timeframe, but it does seem to talk about it. And there's a quote here where it says, talking about kind of areas to focus on, so autonomous systings, boosting recruitment and retention, training for combat, planning as we fight, all that kind of stuff. It talks about areas where I can put my thumb on, the scale where we can make a difference in those areas and make a meaningful contribution to our ability to be ready by 2027. So it's certainly reinforcing a degree of urgency from the CNO. I'm not sure it's an endorsement of the concept of the Davidson window, of course, which is the window put up by the previous commander of Indo-PACOM, previous couple ago, commander of Indo-PACOM, testifying in the US Congress, where he talked about the likelihood of a conflict or likelihood of China attempting to invade Taiwan from 2027. So certainly I think the point that I'd take away from that is that there is a degree of urgency espoused by the US CNO in this plan. And that seems to be a degree of urgency, I think, that is probably missing from some of our strategic documentation. I have put you on the spot on this, but you got any comments or takes on the US CNO's 2024 Navigation Plan.
So I've only skimmed it. It's somewhere under the sea of paper on my desk here, my printed out version. But yes, I thought it looks interesting. As I say, I haven't delved into it particularly deeply. I got the impression that they're trying to pull on some of the threads coming out of the war in Ukraine and things in the Red Sea a little bit, and some of the focus on autonomous is again something personally I'm interested in, but I think it's quite interesting to see how those are changing a little bit, and I think you are beginning to see some slightly different ideas coming through from the previous CNO. But I think the big point, which again I think you've already mentioned, is this idea of doing stuff that can make a difference quickly. And there's been a lot of discussion in the US as well as here about sort of what's going to happen and what the battle force is going to look like in the 2040s. And it's like, okay, well that's great, but actually, what can we do in the next 5 years? And I think that is quite clearly a focus. Whether or not that connects to any kind of specific Davidson window or else, I'm not sure. I would more view it as a development. All of these kind of things which are going to be vital if this enterprise is actually going to work. So you're seeing a little bit more of the tangible steps in that kind of regard, and some statements about the big numbers that are being thrown at the defence industrial bases in both the UK and the US. In terms of Pillar 2, I thought, in fact, there's probably even more in Pillar 2, not all of which is maritime, but again, lots more detail. Pillar 2 has been a kind of a little bit of a black box often, so specifics about what's happening is good. The wonderfully named Maritime Big Play.
Terrible name. Really bad drafting of a communique.
Which is a seemingly primarily autonomous or entirely autonomous focused exercise, and I think the first of these is happening later this year. So it's talking about 30 systems across 4 domains as part of what they're describing as the first large-scale AUKUS integrated demonstration, which will mean whatever it is it means.
I think it means a rebranded autonomous warrior, which is an exercise Australia's been doing for a long time. But anyway, exercise maritime big.
Your cynicism is.
I want to see the first set of memes, by the way, about exercise maritime big play. But anyway, sorry.
Really?
Yes.
I think that's probably inappropriate, whatever those memes are likely to be.
That's not what I was thinking.
Discussion
anyway,
of UUVs. So interesting from my perspective anyway, the fact that the launch and recovery of UUVs is seemingly being rolled out on British subs as well as American ones. Not as of yet any mention of Australian submarines, but clearly this is something where the idea of AUKUS Pillar 2 is speeding up technological diffusion across the 3 countries is working well. There was also quite a lot of interest in statements around the expansion of AUKUS Pillar 2. When you actually read what was said, it is pretty casually couched. So it's saying they welcomed progress on consultations with Japan on improving interoperability with Japan's maritime autonomous systems. Now, quite what progress on consultations means, I don't know, but it's clear that this is an area where they're looking for sort of things to move. What about your thoughts?
Look, I would agree on the concept of the expansion of AUKUS Pillar 2. I just don't see it happening. I think the key is in the name. And for me, AUKUS is all predominantly about Pillar 1. And anything that would put that at risk will be a no-go, certainly for Australia and the UK. That said, I mean, I certainly see the 3 AUKUS countries collaborating with a bunch of other countries on the technologies listed under AUKUS Pillar 2. And in fact, we're already doing that, right? So this year, maybe late last year, Australia signed a research agreement or something similar with Japan to work on UUVs. It's a similar trilateral one on UAVs and integrated air and missile defense as well. So I think it's a comprehensive summary of the status of AUKUS. I think obviously the drafters of the communique, and there's lots to drafting of a communique, were at pains to stress the workforce, the work that had been undertaken to address the workforce issue, not only uniformed workforce issues, but also wider defence industry workforce issues. And I think that certainly those numbers seem to be going well. And so I think it is probably another endorsement of the progress of AUKUS. Of course, though, I think that for AUKUS, the next big thing really is seeing the infrastructure in Western Australia move along. I think somebody had said publicly building was meant to start next year. And really, that will be a crunch point to try and get ready for the rotation of US and potentially UK submarine through HMAS Sterling. So I think that'll be the crunch point. And I'm not sure that we'll see a lot more from a Pillar 1 perspective this year that will change that trajectory or change much of the thinking on AUKUS Pillar 1.
No, I think the only significant AUKUS Pillar 1 events, I suspect, will be trying to work out what the implications of whatever happens in the United States come November are. But that's a whole nother can of worms that I'm going to park for now.
Is it a can of worms? I think it's simple. I don't think there's any implications. I don't think there's any indication. Maybe. I think they've got some bigger concerns at the moment.
I think the whole point is that we just don't know.
That's true. That's true.
That's the real concern, right? Anyway, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Honest, I promise.
No.
Instead, I'm going to put you on the spot, having you put me on the spot, and get you to talk about the USS Bighorn.
Right. Well, we did know this was coming, and we did promise to talk about it. So USS Bighorn is a 42,000-ton tanker with the USNS, so the auxiliary component of the US Navy, for want of a better description. That's not an accurate description, but for want of a better description. It has run aground off the coast of Oman. And taken on a fair bit of water. So it's been recovered now, slipping back into port, but it's out of operation. As we've talked about with the Royal Australian Navy logistic vessels, particularly replenishment vessels, are a key enabler to naval operations, critical enabler. The Bighorn is quite big. It's not just the name, 42,000 tons, and was one of the key ships supplying not only normal fuel for ships, but also aviation fuel. And we know that the carrier is there doing a lot of sorties because of what's happening in the Middle East. So there is a concern about the ability of US ships to replenish in the Middle East without going alongside. There are reportedly 2 other smaller tankers in the region that can support the replenishment, but probably not at the same rate of USS Bighorn. So I think that the key point there is logistics matters in naval operations, and I think that you can't mention that enough. And it kind of brings home, our own troubles with replenishment vessels in the Royal Australian Navy. And I think that the last reporting publicly was a couple of weeks ago, I think an interview with Australia's Chief of Navy, Admiral Mark Hammond, in the Fin Review, that said that neither the supply nor the storeward are likely to be operational till 2025. And it is notable, for example, that I think that's probably the first Kakadu in a long time that Australia's not had a tanker supporting exercise Kakadu. So USS Bighorn, and in the capability space, do you want to talk about somebody's finally put to bed the conversation about whether Hanwha will take over AUSTAL?
Yes, so that's finally folded. Any final sort of discussions of that takeover? The language coming from the Hanwha side was pretty blunt. Seemingly, the AUSTAL were basically putting significant hurdles in the way of them doing due diligence. I don't think there's anything particularly surprising in what we've heard. I think it aligns with reporting that's been going on pretty much since the first announcement of the deal. But it is sort of significant. This was kind of an important, or seen as potentially an important step in sort of developing Australia's naval shipbuilding capability, bringing in major expertise from outside. And you've only got to look at Hanwha's sort of continuing engagement now with the US to see that the South Koreans are seen as being kind of very much at the leading edge of modern shipbuilding practices. So that's not happening. I think, to be honest, the deal seemed pretty far-fetched from the very beginning. The chances of it getting past kind of both Australian and US governments seemed relatively slim. But it does raise sort of questions around AUSTAL. I think AUSTAL's future seems a lot more secure than it was about a year or so ago. But the idea of bringing in a major sort of global shipbuilder to support them and develop them is now gone, and they're going to have to presumably do a lot more of that stuff on their own. So no real surprise, but it'll be interesting to see how this sort of continues to play out. And of course, there's then questions over what this means in terms of the Korean offering for C-3000, the general purpose frigate, and how that then plays out. Whether any bridges have been burnt, I would suspect probably not, but it'll be another piece in that jigsaw.
Yeah, it was interesting. I thought the bid was interesting. I'm not an expert in corporate takeovers, but I thought there was something in terms of the ability of, when you look at the South Korean shipbuilding industry and how they have, a couple of decades now, but in the course of the last 100 years, it is semi-recently become a shipbuilding powerhouse. I thought there was some interesting stuff in that for us. There was, I guess, some eyebrows raised earlier in the year. It might have been around July. There was a 2+2 between South Korea and Australia when the Deputy Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, mentioned that he couldn't necessarily, paraphrasing substantially, but he couldn't necessarily see any issue with it, which certainly got tongues a wagging. On, the general purpose frigate, look, whoever is afforded that will need to work with AUSTAL. It's not been said that AUSTAL will be building the general purpose frigate when we build the 8 in Australia, but given the strategic shipbuilding agreement, the MOU on the strategic shipbuilding agreement signed last year between AUSTAL and the Australian government, it's certainly expected that they will play a key role in it. And although AUSTAL has built many ships, mostly the bigger ones overseas, they haven't built anything like the general purpose frigate yet. So I think there'll need to be certainly some collaboration on that. Speaking of the general purpose frigate, we must be reaching a decision soon. So it's October tomorrow. You would think the decision, I think at some point there was reporting that the decision, or at least the down select to 2 versions, I think there was some reporting, would have to happen this year. And it kind of makes sense given that Australia will be going to an election next year that this would need to be locked and loaded. So I do wonder, I don't know anything on this whatsoever, but I do wonder if we're looking at a decision on that in the next month or so.
Yeah, well, it can't be dragged out for too much longer, considering the timeframes that they're talking about. So we will see. I say this. I have the way in which these things sort of, we get clear statements about what's going to happen, and then the world changes. So who knows? But one does feel that there is significant drive for momentum on this project. So something will happen, and will have to happen quite soon. So,
well, you have to make the assessment that if there's not a down select this year, then you're not on track for a 2029 operational general purpose frigate in the Royal Australian Navy. But anyway, on that note, I think that's about all we've got time for. In fact, we've gone well over time. Is there anything that you think we've missed? Anything exciting that's happened in the world of maritime?
I don't think so. I think we've covered more than enough ground for this week to assert once again that maritime matters, which is obviously the main aim of the podcast, right?
True. Maritime does matter. Well, thank you very much for that, Richard. We will drop some of the links to some of those publications that we mentioned in the show notes. Keep an eye out in the next 7 days for a new episode of the Saltwater Strategist, the Australian Naval Institute's podcast dropping, where I will speak to Tom Sugar from CNAS about the People's Liberation Army Navy and their challenges with submarines, including the recent submarine that's reported to have sunk.
Been good chatting.
Thanks, Richard.
Cheers then.